host of News Insight, Kang Mi-eun. Today we are joined by our panelists, Professor Shin Sang-hyuk and Professor Lee Young-eum. Let's first take a look at our 60-second news update.
The main rival parties have finally reached a tentative agreement on ratifying the Korea-China Free Trade Deal. To compensate the agricultural sector, approximately $86 million will be funded per year over 10 years, reaching a total of $864 million. This decision helped the agreement pass through the National Assembly. Kakao and KT will enter the banking industry. The two consortiums led by Kakao and KT, Korea Kakao Bank and K-Bank, respectively won preliminary licenses to launch internet-only banks. At these two internet-only banks, financial and banking services such as setting up accounts, payments, loans, and sale of products are offered online without the existence of physical locations. The UN Climate Change Conference, also known as the Conference of the Parties, will be held from November 30th to December 11th in Paris, France. The conference will set out a pathway to limit the rise in global temperature to less than 2 degrees Celsius by the end of the 21st century. The participation from 150 country leaders will truly make this a UN General Assembly of Climate. Also, President Park Geun-hye is set to deliver a speech at the event.
Let's examine our first discussion topic. This week, the United Nations Climate Change Conference was held in Paris, and we are going to examine what its goals are, what its challenges are. So Professor Shin, first I'd like to ask you, what were the major concerns reviewed in the conference?
Well, at this year's UN Climate Change Conference, which was held in Paris, the world leaders discussed a successor treaty to the 1997 Kyoto Protocol. As you know very well, the Kyoto Protocol is planned to be expired in 2020. Okay. And particularly at this conference, the leaders emphasized the actions by the member countries themselves. As you know very well, at the previous the summit meetings, the leaders discussed how to set the targets for emission gas reduction, but this time they emphasized the actions. And particularly, President Park Geun-hye also introduced our ambitious goal of the reducing the greenhouse gas emission by 37% by the year 2030. And actually, she also emphasized the international the cooperation for the launch of the new climate change system. And in addition to that, the suggestion, she also introduced what kind of efforts South Korean government has made in order to fulfill its contribution to the emission gas reduction.
Yes. Professor Lee, what do you think is the political and economic challenges at this conference?
Well, in terms of politics, the world leaders with different political motives need to try to cooperate with each other. The two largest carbon dioxide emitting countries are China and the US, and those two countries have been at odds with each other in several political arena, and so it is going to be a challenge for them to come to a cooperative and an amicable solution. And in terms of the economy, each country is going to have to take responsibility for cutting down energy and spending more money to cut down carbon dioxide emission and to replace the use of fossil fuels with renewable energy. Right. So many.
Yes, as we all know, terrorism and climate change are the two biggest threats facing our planet. So this conference in particular holds a special significance due to increasing concern over climate change. And according to the report released by the United Nations, there are damages brought by the climate change, and these damages are very severe. And what is the magnitude of the damages around the world?
Well, according to the UN report, which you reported just before, over the last 20 years, total number of the victims sacrificed their lives was about 600,000. So it's a huge number
Huge
of
number.
lives. And the estimated economic loss was about the $250 billion or up to $300 billion. This is very huge. And the one thing which I wanted to emphasize is, according to this report, 9 cases out of 10, the most damages caused by the global warming impact. I mean, natural disasters caused by the global warming. Well, as you know, the global warming is directly related to climate change. And also, according to the World Bank, within 15 years, if the global community does not prepare, to deal with this issue properly, definitely about the 100 billion people will live in the extreme poverty circumstances. So we can say that the climate change can pose, actually poses direct threats to the all human beings, their life itself.
Right. So the problem of climate change is not just about polar bears. Many countries are experiencing serious damages from the climate change on crops, on households, through severe storms and drought. So one of the main reasons for the severe climate is the increasing amount of greenhouse gas emission. And let's take a look at the countries that emit the most greenhouse gases. And Professor Lee, would you please explain the graph here?
Yes, when we are saying greenhouse gas emission, we are actually talking about carbon dioxide, because carbon dioxide acts almost like a heat-trapping blanket that is encircling the Earth and is warming the globe. And so if we look at the countries with the most amount of greenhouse gas emission is China, US, the EU, India, and of course, Korea is among the top 10. And although this graph only shows the amount of increase, this is actually the order in which these countries are actually emitting greenhouse gas. So we can say that those countries with the most amount of carbon dioxide emission is increasing the most. So actually, when we get down to the details, it is not going to be an easy solution.
Right. But the positive attitudes from the major contributors of the greenhouse gas emission, the United States and China, is encouraging, isn't it? And we can think of the goals of this Paris talk. One of the goals would be putting the issue at the top table of the leaders to reach the global agreement. And we can think of some differences of this particular conference compared to its predecessors in the past?
Yes, I think the new system, is based on the, one of the big arguments about the new climate change system is whether we can put some legal enforcement on the targets or not. There are some countries takes a pros stance for this idea, or the others are taking the con side. Korea is right now standing on the side supporting the voluntary constraints of the voluntary reduction of the emission gases. So like this, this system is different from the previous one. Under the Kyoto Protocol agreement, the member countries set targets for the emission gas reduction. They were, it's like it has a legal obligations on it. So the many countries should keep their promises or plan. But as you know very well, many of them fail to keep their promises. So there are some arguments about which one is the best way to make the member countries realize, what they promised. So under the new scheme, under the new climate system, there are some more people supporting the idea. Member countries set a target voluntarily, the targets for the emission gas reduction. And I think personally, this is the good approach to maximize the effectiveness in efforts to the emission gas reduction.
Yes, the Kyoto Protocol was considered to be the top-down approach, and this Paris talk is going to be bottom-up approach.
Yes.
And somebody said in the news analysis that the predecessors of the climate change conferences in the past, a lot of countries' leaders overpromised and then they underdelivered.
Yes, yes.
But this time they are under-promising and they are delivering.
Right.
So that's important difference, I think. And there is possibility for a new climate agreement resulting from this conference. And realistically, Professor Lee, what do you see coming out of this conference?
Yes, when we consider the fact that more than 150 countries have submitted their pledges coming into the conference, in the beginning of the conference, there were high hopes that there actually is going to be a coordinated effort and that all they needed to do was just stitch together these pledges and they will have a global plan. However, there's an independent group called Climate Action Tracker that has assessed these pledges and have found that most of the high carbon dioxide emission countries have made pledges that are not considered to be actually adequate. And so it is going to be a challenge.
Right. And President Park Geun-hye said at the meeting that the climate change should be viewed as an opportunity to secure a new growth engine, not a burden. And also our government has announced a strategy to develop and expand the new energy industries as preparation for the new climate agreement.
Right.
And what do you think about the Korean government's vision and strategy?
Well, actually, the Korean government started the efforts to reduce the emission gas from the previous administration, actually. So we had the experience in reducing the emission gas over the last several years. But this time, under the incumbent administration, President Park Geun-hye introduced the new strategies. The South Korean government tried to reduce the emission gas through the promotion of the energy industries. Well, according to the government, announcement, the Korea will be able to create a new market, the worth about $100 billion by the year 2030. And then through this kind of efforts, they could provide about 500,000 new jobs. So I think this vision and approach seems to be very active, and I think it's quite a very good idea, I think. And on the top of this idea, in fact, the Korean government, as a part of the plan, suggested very detailed plans. They make the Jeju Island a carbon-free island. Also, they introduced the plan which tried to make zero energy building obligatory step to step. So this means that the Korean government suggested a very detailed plan to achieve their goal in an effort to reduce the emission gas. I think their visions and strategies seems to be okay at the moment.
Right. So I've noticed the changes in vocabulary in the Paris talk. Instead of saying greenhouse gas emission, people started using the phrase carbon pollution, emphasizing the urgency of this problem.
Right, right.
And also instead of global warming, people started using the phrase climate crisis, also emphasizing the urgency. So Professor Lee, what were your thoughts on the Paris talk this time around?
Well, with regard to Korea, actually South Korea was commended by some of the commentators for having successfully implementing a green growth strategy that is relatively comprehensive and covering a variety of policy areas. And so in that respect, internationally, Korea did a relatively satisfactory job.
And I think it's important to see the issue of climate change in terms of not in a dichotomy, either or question. It's not either the environment or the economy. These things work together. We have analyzed the content and tasks discussed at the Conference of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Let's explore national issues now. Many people have voiced a strong opinion to the legislating on the Anti-terrorism Act in Korea due to the rising threat of insecurities caused by terrorism. We will examine what the main issues are behind the controversial anti-terrorism legislation. After the 2001 9/11 terrorist attacks in the United States, an Anti-terrorism Act was proposed in Korea, and nothing has been done about it until now, due to the wide differences on the content between rivaling parties. So, Professor Shin, what are the opposing views on this particular legislation?
Well, as you pointed out, there have been several attempts to pass anti-terrorism laws in the National Assembly. Well, actually, this was started when the President Kim Dae-jung was in the presidency. But since that time on, these kind of attempts have been blocked in the National Assembly because of the worries. Some worries, the worries which that maybe this can be abused or this can be used to oppress human rights. So actually, those kind of opinions were taken by the opposition party. And then for the last 14 years, the opposition party and ruling party failed to compromise the differences about this issue at National Assembly. So this has been the major reasons why we cannot have the Anti-terrorism Act in Korea.
And there is strong resistance in establishing the National Intelligence Service as the control tower for this anti-terrorism law, which has been infamous for violating human rights in the past. So would you explain more about that argument?
National Intelligence Service has been very notorious as a government agency, state agency, violating human rights. Yes, it's true. So for the last 14 years in National Assembly, the opposition party has pointed that, put the first priorities on that point as a reason why they are against the idea to pass the Anti-terrorism Act in the National Assembly. But I think the point we have to think about at this moment is, Korea is no more the terrorism-free country in the world. A few days ago, according to the report, Korea is included as one of the target country announced by the IS. And we arrested the immigrants who had the IS flags, one of the terrorist the group's flag, and who has also supported the IS activities. So I think it is certain that we are not anymore the terrorism-free country. So this is very urgent issues. So I think at the moment, the politicians in the parliament do change their attitude. They should work together to find a solution to this issue. So far they just stand their position about this issue. They just criticize each other. But I think no more such a kind of attitude can be accepted by the people, because the terrorism is the part of our life. Not part of life means that we are directly exposed to the threat posed by the terrorism. So I think the politicians should change their attitude to find a solution to this issue, I think.
Yeah, Professor Lee, what are the opposing arguments against this anti-terrorism bill?
Well, when you have a terror attack such as the one in Paris, civil liberties groups accuse the law enforcement agencies of ensuing this power grab attempt to increase their abilities for surveillance. And actually, even in the US, the FBI has been accused of such a power grab attempt, especially right after the 9/11 attacks. And recently, after the Paris attacks, the FBI chief also made a statement very similar to the need for increased surveillance. And so there is that attempt, but the problem is if the anti-terrorism bill is too overarching, and there are accusations by the opposition that the series of legislation on anti-terrorism is too overarching. And so there is a need to pinpoint the threat of terror and to apply those laws only where you see actual or imminent or significant threat.
Right. The opposition party in Korea expressed concern over this Anti-terrorism Act, saying that if we give the NIS too much superpower outside the law, it might collect information on individuals who are considered to be the security risks, but who decides who will be the security risks.
Right.
And there could be some possibility of human rights violation here. That's the argument from the opposition party. So as an alternative to this problem, many people agree that a new organization in charge of anti-terrorism should be established. So how other countries are dealing with this anti-terrorism legislation?
Yes, as I explained very briefly, among the OECD member countries, G20 member countries, except for 4 countries out of 42 of the countries, member countries of OECD and G20 member countries, they do not have any anti-terrorism act. But how about the situation? Which government organization are in charge of this anti-terrorism act activities? In most European countries, the national state intelligence agencies are dealing with this the responsibility. Let me tell you more detailed information. In the United States, Department of Homeland Security, they are in charge of the measures to prevent the terrorism attack in the United States. And in France, there is the National Intelligence Agency named DIST. DIST stands for Directorate of Territorial Security. And how about the UK? UK, as we know very well, there is MI5 and MI6. Well, we are very familiar to these names because of one of the
007.
Yes, but under the name of the JTAC. JTAC stands for Joint Terrorism Analysis Center, which is one of the arms organization. So like this, the state central agencies are in charge of the anti-terrorism measures.
Right. The legislation was delayed for 14 years in total. And it seems that the reaching agreement on this anti-terrorism law is just as challenging. And what are your thoughts on the Anti-terrorism Act, Professor Lee? And how do you think it should progress?
Well, I think that both political parties actually have agreed to legislate anti-terrorism bill, but the focus should actually be on placing limits on the bill so as not to allow it to overarchingly and sometimes menacingly surveillance, engage in surveillance activities against the average citizen. And so that is something that we should keep in mind, and that is something that will be able to ease the fears of the opposition. And so that is something that we should really focus on. Because when we look at the Patriot Act and other security acts in the US, there is something called a peek and see bill that allows law enforcement officials to go into people's houses without telling them, and they only have to let them know a year after. And recently it was reported by the Electronic Frontier Foundation that of the more than 11,000 sneak and peek requests, only 51 were attributed to terrorist activities. And so even in the US, you can see the overarching and wide-ranging sort of way that these law enforcement officials are utilizing this bill. And so that's something that we should guard ourselves against.
Right.
Well,
the surveillance of
yes.
civilians.
Can I
That's
add
problem.
one
Yeah,
thing
sure.
more? Well, in fact, many the ideas have been introduced about who will take in charge of the this mission. Actually, well, according to the opposition party, they said that NSC, National Security Council, at the presidential office should take in charge of this responsibility. And also they said that why not one of the new agencies should be established at the Prime Minister's office. There are many suggestions and ideas introduced by many people and many experts. But the one point which I want to underline is, I think whatever it is, in some sense, the both parties, ruling parties and opposition parties, they should take the very pragmatic path to find the solution to this issue. Otherwise, we cannot make any progress in an effort to find a solution to to fight against the terrorism, I think.
Well, in the U.S., in the wake of the 9/11 attacks in 2001, the Department of Homeland Security was created. So, and currently, not just that institution, but FBI and other intelligence agencies are involved in it. And so, also in the UK, many departments cooperate with each other. And so, I don't think it's just it's a matter of which department or which body. It is a matter of going to the right places. Doing the right searches, pinpointing your targets, and also to come up with a more concrete definition of what terrorism is.
It seems as though that this controversial legislation on anti-terrorism needs to be approached with caution and discussed thoroughly beforehand. It has been noted that the Japanese media's bashing of Korea is contributing to the anti-Korean sentiments in Japan. We will now discuss the problems surrounding Japanese media's attitude towards Korea. The offensive reports on Korea made by Japanese media outlets have been going on for a long time. We have prepared footage on the topic.
A special segment on Korea featured on Japan's Fuji TV went on to belittle Korea with their inappropriate comments. An interview from a Korean high school girl was also misreported. This isn't the only problem that occurred recently. In 2013, a video titled "Korea is a country that drinks feces wine" was embroiled in controversy after being posted by Japanese media. Feces wine is a term used by Japan's right wing to degrade Korea. This video received a high number of views. On top of that, some foreign media outlets are sourcing such bizarre contents that are actually unknown to Koreans. In 2009, Japan canceled the airing of Hitalia, an animation degrading Korea. Korean netizens even held a campaign to stop the broadcast. There are endless Japanese broadcasts belittling Korea. It's becoming an even bigger problem because the truth is hidden behind such undermining information, and this is being spread to the public.
Due to this kind of press reporting, the perceived images of Korea in Japan are increasingly deteriorated. What do you think about this particular phenomena, Professor Lee?
Yes, it is highly unfortunate. Japan is a country that is so close, but so far. Korea, Japan have some, what you might call a love-hate relationship. Korean people love Japanese products, but sometimes politically we are at odds with each other. And recently, there have been a series of surveys on the perception of Korea by the Japanese people, by the Korean government, by the Japanese government, by various institutions. And it was surprising to see as high as 70% of the Japanese having an unfavorable opinion of Korea. And so this has affected businesses in Japan related to Korea. K-pop stars are not as popular anymore. Rallies, anti-Korean rallies are taking place in Korea. So I think it's a very unfortunate situation. And I think you can attribute these anti-Korean sentiments to either economic or political situations.
Yes. And also it is said that these opposing views or problematic media reporting persist in Japan for commercial purposes. And what do you think are other reasons for the anti-Korean sentiment?
Well, as Professor Lee already pointed out, there must be some political reasons as well as the, business-oriented reasons. I mean, well, in case of the mass media industry in Japan, actually, to draw the attention from the people, I think this anti-Korean sentiment can be one of the very interesting topic for them to draw the attention from the people. They do not care about whether it is true or not. I think this attitude should be criticized, particularly SNS or the small and medium-sized media outlet in Japan. They just try to report without any confirmation about whether the report is true or not. I think so. This is one of the problems. And secondly, I think this is one of the major reasons why the anti-Korean sentiment in Japan became more stronger than before. Is the Prime Minister Abe changed Japanese constitution. Actually, there were serious opposition constitution change to divert the people's criticism to a different one. Actually, I think Prime Minister Abe used this anti-Korean sentiment as a way to divert the attention, criticism against their efforts. Their trial to change their constitution. Actually, the supporting rate for his administration recorded 36%, which is the lowest one since the administration was started. But after the many reports were introduced about the anti-Korean sentiments through the mass media, actually he could recover such a low supporting rates from the people. So I think this kind of approaches, actions, measures taken by the Japanese government brought anti-Japanism in Korean society as well. I think this is really regretful to see this kind of things happening in the relationship between Korea and Japan.
So in other words, the rise in this kind of reporting correlates with the current political situation in Japan. And is it correct that there are studies that show the growing intensity of anti-Korean sentiment associated with the political situation in Japan?
Yes, not just the politics, but I would like to add one additional element to the factor, and that is the Japanese self-confidence and the rise of Hallyu. Because if you look at the Japanese society's opinion of Korea since 2003, with the surprisingly phenomenal success of Winter Sonata and the popularity of its lead character, Bae Young-jun. They call him Yun Sama. Right. Japanese love for Korea actually had grown. And they started learning Korean, they started eating Korean food, and so businesses related to Korea started to flourish. Korean pop stars became stars in Japan. But then, with the unexpected level of popularity of K-pop, maybe over even J-pop, and with the continued lagging of the Japanese economy, I think people started to feel maybe not as superior to other countries as before, And so the rise of Hallyu was considered considered by some of the right-wing Japanese people to be contributing to the sort of an unhealthy sort of influence on the Japanese society. And so that, I think, can explain the intensity of the emotion.
Right. And it has been pointed out that in order to fix this problem, both Korea and Japan need to improve their media coverage. And with what attitude and strategy should South Korean government or the public should respond to the Japanese media in the future?
Well, I think both countries should work together very seriously and to find a solution to this issue, I think. As I said before, this uncomfortable relationship between two countries never ever seemed to be good for both countries. Right. So we have to find a solution to strengthen or restore the diplomatic relations between two countries. So the next question we have to find an answer to do this one is that from where and how we're going to start. I think that regarding the report about the anti-Korean sentiment, or report about the anti-Japanese sentiment in Korea, I think we have to form a joint research groups, from both countries, and then to find the way to get rid of this kind of the undesirable path or the measures taken by both governments and both mass media or whatever. So I think if I introduce one of the ideas suggested by the one research think tank, that is that establish some filtering system, which screens the unappropriate or inaccurate the reports, which can make the anti-Japanism in Korea, anti-Koreanism in Korean sentiment in Japan, by having those kind of filtering system in both countries. Definitely, we can minimize the negative the aspect of the false reports, inaccurate reports, from the mass media in both countries. Yeah. And secondly, on the long-term basis, I think we have to find a solution how to strengthen the mutual understanding about the two countries, particularly among young generations. I think because the young generations will be the actors, in the future, which means that by having them have an opportunity to understand each other more accurately, then I think that they will be helpful for us to get rid of those kind of uncomfortable relations between two countries in the future, I think.
Another sort of trend that goes in parallel with the Japanese sentiment is the change in the stance of the Japanese government itself with regard to these controversial issues or historical issues. If the government was more amenable to apologizing, Koreans' sentiment towards Japan improved, and vice versa. And so I think it in part lies with the leaders also. Currently, the government of Japan is leaning towards an extreme right-wing stance, and maybe that is the reason why the anti-Korean sentiment seems to have been growing. Let's just hope that our leaders get into a better sort of relationship with each other and realize that Korea and Japan are actually close countries that can benefit greatly from each other.
Thank you for your insightful comment, both professors. As the Korea-Japan relations mark a turning point, there is a stronger need to abate the aggravation of anti-Korean sentiment. See you next week on News Inside. Thank you for watching.
수고하셨습니다.